Just a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Germany, grew up in a small town called Mühldorf, which is shown here in that picture, about an hour east of Munich. And I went to work for a small brewery in town for about 2 years, basically doing an apprenticeship. Worked for a bunch of other places. Worked in England for a small brewery, came back to study at the University of Munich at Weinstefan. Then worked in England again for a small brewery at the time called Meantime, which is now quite a bit larger and was, I think, just sold to, SAB Miller a while ago, and has changed some ownership, so that's grown quite a bit. And then ended up here in the US working for the other big brewery in town, although I was in Newark, New Jersey at the time when I first came over, and I was transferred here to St. Louis to the headquarters down the road. Working on mostly specialty beers, on the Michelob lineup, and then the last 2 years I was there, I worked on the yeast propagation plant, or I managed the yeast propagation facility that they have, and they basically send out yeast to make bud in the whole world, and it was kind of fun to do that. The first beer we're going to be tasting, which I think is going to get handed out very soon, is one of our, I think, staples now almost. We just decided to add that to our year-round lineup, and it's a beer called Dorf Beir, Dorf Beir. Dorf in German just means village, and this picture back here, you sort of see, is my hometown, which is Mühldorf, so it's a mill village, I guess, is the translation. So it's a nice little cameo appearance of my hometown on the label. And the beer is a very traditional Bavarian-style dunkel. So a lot of malty notes, a lot of Munich malt that we use for that beer. I do have one here already. It's got a nice dark color. About 5% alcohol, about 20 IBUs, so not too hoppy, really just enough hops there to balance out the sweetness. And the malt is really what is the key in this beer. As I said, it's mostly Munich malt. We use a little bit of caramel and roasted malt just to get the color up a little bit and to increase the sweetness just a touch, but mostly it's Munich malt. And Munich malt is kilned at higher temperatures than your regular Pilsner malt, and that's why it gets that darker color. This beer is a lager, so it is fermented at fairly low temperatures. We fermented it, and I'll have to make the conversion, about 8 to 10 degrees centigrade, so that's about 45, 50 Fahrenheit for about a week for primary fermentation. Then we cool it down and let it mature for another couple weeks or so to settle the yeast out a little bit, mature the beer, and at that point, once we decide that the flavor is good, we send it to our finished beer tanks where the beer is basically ready for packaging. One thing I have to say, we don't filter any of our beers, so they are typically just a little bit hazy, which you can see in this beer. I guess you could see if you had a glass. So there's a little bit of yeast in there still, and probably a little bit of protein from the malt, which makes it naturally cloudy. Any questions on this one? So when you taste it, when you smell it, I definitely get that malty, maybe. Yeah, that's coming after this. Yeah, so definitely some malty notes, maybe a little bit a hint of caramel. Definitely some sweetness there, so it's definitely on the sweeter side, but that's kind of the style itself. As I said, it's the classic Bavarian style that really started to become popular around Munich, and the reason why this type of beer did so well or became popular is because the water in Munich is fairly hard, so they couldn't make a light Pilsner beer that had a very delicate hop balance. They had to kind of make a beer that was more malt focused, and this is the result of that. Yeah, we do, from a water treatment perspective, we don't do a whole lot, I have to say, because the water here is pretty good. We typically add a little bit of salt, calcium chloride, calcium salt basically to it, just to boost up the calcium content a little bit. We don't try to match the water that's in Munich, I would say that, but we try to modify it a little bit just to get it to that. I get another one, excellent, thank you. I will happily drink that. I know, speed up a little bit. Yes?
Is there any significance to, I know that you had a couple series, the Reverence and that was the other one, but to the number 3?
No, basically, so basically, what I probably should have said before, I'll be talking a little bit about the brewery, about our breweries, a little bit of our history, which kind of sounds funny because we've only been around for 5 years. About our 2 newest projects, about a brewery in Germany, and then we are putting together a small pilot brewery, and I've got some pictures of that. And at the end, we're going to be tasting the rare beer that Chad was talking about. So I'll talk about the Revolution and Reverend series, but really they're just the numbers when we first brewed the beer. So Zwickel was number 1, I believe. And then whenever we added a new beer, we just took the next number. So there really is, it's more of a historic reference, I guess, for our internal counting purposes, but nothing other than that. I did talk about the hops a little bit. Again, it's not totally critical, obviously, because it's not a hoppy beer, but we do use a variety called Hersbrucker in this beer, which is one of the land race varieties out of Germany, I guess. So it's one of the very historic and old varieties that has been around for a very, very long time. Very classic aroma variety, and really, really, really nice hop, although it doesn't really get to shine in this beer because it's really not about the hops, it's really about the malt. Any questions on this one? Okay. Thank you. I do like this too. I mean, it definitely is. I'm typically more of I like drier beers, but I do like that malty sweetness, and it's definitely, to me, it's thirst quenching because it's not too strong. It's about 5% alcohol, and it has a nice balance. Yeah, we try to, when we mash our beers or ferment our beers, I don't like beers that are very sweet towards the end. I want it to go away fairly quick, and I think you get the sweetness from the malt, but it definitely kind of goes away somewhat fast, which to me adds to the drinkability. I'm not a huge fan of that term, but I think it does. So you had already mentioned our Reverence and Revolution series. So I do want to talk a little bit about our philosophy. When we first started thinking about opening up Urban Chestnut, and I basically worked with Dave Wolf, my business partner at AB, and he was on the sales and marketing side. I was on the brewing side. We worked on a few projects together, and I honestly don't remember exactly when the idea came up, but we started thinking about setting up our own brewery about 6 years ago, somewhere in there. And I'm originally from Germany. I grew up in Germany, lived there for 20 plus years, have my brewing education, spent most of the time on the brewing side in Germany. I didn't just want to limit ourselves to just making German beers. I love German beers, but I worked in Belgium, I worked in the UK, I worked in the US, and I wanted to be able to brew other beer styles as well. So we came up with the basically strategy that we wanted to be able to brew old world beers, but then also have a series where we have room to experiment. And that's what we did. And that whole thing is also reflected in our name. Urban standing for the new world, for the resurgence of craft beer in urban centers like St. Louis. And then the chestnut part comes from chestnut trees being used to shade beer cellars when there wasn't artificial refrigeration. They basically harvested ice out of little lakes around breweries to cool the beer throughout the summer. They basically took the ice, put it in the beer cellar, and then cooled the beer with that. And to keep the sun away from the soil, they planted chestnut trees because they've got very dense foliage. And eventually they figured out they could sell some beer under those chestnut trees, and that's how beer gardens became to be. So Bavarian brewers are very smart, I guess, in that way. And that's our tie-in into the old world. So again, the whole approach is kind of this old new world approach, and we try to stay true to that as much as we can. One thing I have to say, I did work at a small brewery just outside of my hometown, and they had a beer garden, and they did still harvest ice out of a small little pond, probably about, well, I guess it's been 20 years. I'm not sure if they still do it, but I used to do it a couple times when it was cold enough, and it was a lot of work, because you're basically taking a pretty big saw onto the ice, you cut the ice out, and then you have to, they had this little hole that they had to smash the ice through, so it was a lot of physical work, and obviously it was cold, so, but still fascinating to see how that was done. The picture here actually shows the main square in Freising, which is home of Weinstefan University, so that's where I lived for several years, and basically representing our Reverend series, which is the classic old world series of beers that we make. And Dorf Beir is part of that series. The modern New World approach is the Revolution series, here represented by the Arch in St. Louis. I guess I didn't come up with a better picture, but I guess it works in our case. And I already said, basically allowing us to use new ingredients, combine new ingredients in a new way, play around with different things, different hop varieties. We have a chestnut beer called Wingnut, and so on. So always having the opportunity to come up with something new. Our flagships of both of the series are Zwickel, which is our lager, which you may be familiar with, and then Wingnut, the chestnut ale, that's representing the Revolution series here.
Before we go any further, is there anybody that's not ever had an Urban Chestnut beer in the room ever? Anybody?
That's good.
I mean, just making sure. I just want to see. Is there anybody that's never had Zwickel? Anybody?
Oh, that's impressive. Yeah.
How about Wingnut? There's a few people that haven't had Wingnut. You should try it. There you go. Okay, anyway.
Nice little.
We're not tasting that one tonight, but.
Yeah, we're tasting some of the probably newer stuff, I'd say, which brings us to the next one. Although this is as you can tell by the Revolution Series #2, this is one of the first beers that we brewed, but again, just added that to the regular lineup not too long ago, probably actually just a week ago. I guess we've been talking about it because all these things take a long time to print labels and boxes and make sure you have beer ready to go.
All the beers we're tasting tonight, except for the last one, are about a week, right? Yeah. They're all just brand new. A week is the oldest one. The rest of them just got released basically yesterday. So all the other ones we're going to taste, you guys are some of the very first people to taste any of them. So.
Very, very fresh. The other two that are coming after this are from our sampler pack. So yeah, we just packaged those a few days ago too. So Hopfen is basically the German word for hops. And when we first started brewing, that was kind of a interesting way to come up with we obviously wanted to make an IPA, but we wanted to add a little twist to it. So we made a IPA, IPL, India style pale lager, using lager ingredients. So we used Pilsner malt from Germany, our regular Pilsner malt that we use for all of our German beers. Thank you very much. And I'm definitely not keeping up. We used hops from Hallertau, a very classic hop varieties, variety called Hallertau Mittelfrüh. Again, a land race variety. It's probably my preferred hop variety that there is. Very subtle, but has some nice herbal, grassy, spicy notes, maybe a little bit of fruitiness, but very subtle and very, very balanced and nice. And we fermented this beer with a lager yeast, slightly higher than your typical lager, but still used the lager, or are using a lager yeast in that process, in the fermentation process. And then we also dry hop the beer. So typically, I'm assuming you know, dry hopping is basically adding hops to the fermentation tank versus typically just adding it to the brew kettle. So basically adding more hop aroma and hop flavor through the addition of that hops in that process. We use a little bit of, mostly it's Hallertau Mittelfrüh. There's a little bit of Perle in there as well, but the majority is Hallertau Mittelfrüh. And Mittelfrüh is semi-early, so Hallertau is the area that hop originated from, which is just north of Munich, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. And Mittelfrüh is semi-early, so basically just refers to the harvest time. So semi-early, I'm not exactly sure, sometime in August, I guess. But that's how the farmers at the point where they didn't have the technology to distinguish different genomes, they were able to say, hey, this is the hop variety that's ready semi-early sometime in August. Well, typically, there's no Hallertau late something. There's a Hersbruck late, Hersbruck spät. Yeah, there's definitely some names that refer to that, yeah. So it's kind of interesting, because nowadays they come up with these fancy names, but at the time it was really just the region where they came from and when they were harvested. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. For this beer, yes, but we do now. We buy hops from the U.S., a little bit from New Zealand, England, small amount from France, from Alsace. Zwickels are our largest brand or our largest volume beer, but at about 20 IBUs, the amount of hops that we use in that is relatively small compared to some of the IPAs. So we probably buy more American hops for our American beers because the hop usage rates are so much higher compared to the German style beers. This has a good amount of hops in it, similar to an IPA, I would say. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've done studies where even a week of harvesting time difference will make a difference in the hop. I mean, it's fairly subtle, but there's definitely a difference. It's kind of interesting because you would think as a brewer, why don't they just harvest them when they're perfect? But the problem is the farmer has only so much equipment, they have only so many people to harvest hops, so they harvest them when they get to them, basically. And when they plant hops, they cannot just plant one variety typically, they have to kind of spread it out so that the early harvesting, or the hops that's ready for an early harvest just kind of finishes up when the next one is ready for harvest. So they have to really plan that out, which is kind of fascinating from a farmer's perspective. But yeah, there's definitely differences in the flavor and the aroma when based on the time frame. And obviously, if the weather changes, if it's too wet or it gets dry all of a sudden, that's going to impact it as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, typically we try to blend as much as possible, so we don't try to go from one crop year to the next. We try to kind of blend previous year with a new harvest so that we have a little less dramatic change, but we definitely adjust the recipe based on that. Any comments on the beer? It's pretty. It's lighter, so it's not. Again, it's pretty easy finish, fast finish. Probably about 45-ish. So it's definitely up there. 6, and thank God I looked it up. Because we make so many beers that I don't always have that information present. So, but I did look that up before.
Do you guys like this one? It's got a little bit of bitterness, but it's not overwhelming really at all. It's kind of nice and refreshing since it's a lager, but it still has kind of that bitterness to it, but not super heavy.
Yeah, and we, for the most part, use aroma hops. We don't really use a whole lot of bittering hop varieties, which I think they aroma hop varieties create a nicer bitterness, a much cleaner bitterness. But that's personal preference, I guess. So a little bit more about our philosophy. This happens to be another Florien Seitz. He runs a hop farm in Hallertau, not too far from where our new brewery is. That's his dog, and unfortunately that picture doesn't do him any justice because that dog is the size of a cow, basically. When you pull up to the farm, he definitely is almost, or is pretty much ready to attack you, but then once he figures out who you are, he just becomes very calm and very friendly. His name is Simmel, which is Simon, basically, in English. And yeah, he basically runs the place and gets spoiled all day long. Florian runs the farm, as I said. He took that over from his father, and then I think the farm's been in the family ownership for 4 or 5 generations. So it's been there for a very, very long time. And the one thing I'm trying to say with this that we really try to focus on where we get our ingredients from. We have very good relationships with all of our suppliers, if that's malt houses or hop suppliers or hop growers. And to me, it's fascinating to use the hops, but it's also very interesting and really fun to see what the challenges of the hop growers are. So by visiting him and talking to him, and he grows quite a bit of our Hallertau Mittelfrüh for us. And it's not a variety that farmers like because it's fairly difficult to grow. The yields aren't very high. But he takes pride in what he's doing, and I think being able to work with us, he sees where the hops are going instead of him just selling them to some large broker, and then he wouldn't know where they're being used. So it's kind of fun to have that relationship. The benefit is also whenever we visit, his mom usually makes a nice pork roast, so it doesn't matter when we show up. So nice added benefit. I have no idea what he's drinking there. Hopefully water, because this work is when they harvest. So this is during harvest. So they cut the hop plants down, and then they feed them into this machine, and the machine strips the hop flowers off the vine, and very, very dangerous because there's a lot of moving parts. Thank you very much. And it basically goes from 5, 6 o'clock in the morning till 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. They dry him on site. And he's got a sort of a couch next to the dryer on that little mezzanine there, and basically sleeps. They basically work nonstop for 4 to 6 weeks, which is pretty rough. Yeah. So hopefully it's coffee. I'm sure there's some beer involved, but you got to be careful what you do. So yeah, ingredients very, very important. The other thing is quality control. We now have 4 people that work in quality assurance, quality control for us. Our quality assurance manager, we have somebody that does our taste panels, and we're expanding that quite a bit. That's kind of fun, and always wants to be part of those. But really focusing on the flavor. We have one guy that works basically in the QA lab to analyze our beers, and another person to kind of manage some of the quality assurance projects. So again, focus on quality. We grow up our own yeast. We do a lot of testing on site and have a pretty nice lab and spent a lot of money on that. So definitely focus on that to make sure that the beer tastes the same every time we make it. And then one other thing before we get to the next beer that we taste is sustainability. We have really focused a lot on that aspect. Actually, all of our breweries, including the one in Germany, have solar panels on the roof. This one here is the Midtown Brewery, has a 10 kilowatt system. The Grove Brewery has a 25 kilowatt system on the roof. The building at the Grove, when we started working on that, we did basically we took all the measures to get it LEED certified. So it's a standard for green building, I guess. So we have LED lighting that is on motion sensors. We have low flow faucets. As that we have the solar panels. The tables inside the beer hall were made from a tree that basically came down during a storm here locally by a local furniture maker. and I always forget half of it. Recycling is a big thing. I think 95+% of the waste that we produce actually gets recycled, if that's glass, paper, cardboard, plastic, or spent grain. So really focusing on that aspect of the business. Brewing beer is very resource intensive. We use a lot of energy and a lot of materials, but we really try to focus on trying to keep that to a minimum as much as we can. Okay, which brings us to the next beer. This one here is a little bit stronger. You may be able to tell by smelling it. So it's about 9% alcohol. This is a Belgian-style golden ale, and the name is Wittewiven, or basically wise women, based on a tale, I guess, from Belgium from several hundred years ago, or over almost 1,500 years ago, that were considered healers or possibly also pranksters. Definitely a nice golden color, hence the name golden ale, and you can definitely pick some of the fruity notes from the yeast that we use to ferment this beer. So it's malt, yeast, hops, and water, obviously. There's no fruit or any spices in there. It's really just those 4 ingredients. And the yeast strain that we used definitely produces those nice, fruity, spicy aroma notes.
Talking about the difference between a ale yeast and a lager yeast, why did the German beers with the lager yeast, which is more difficult to ferment because you have to keep it at cool temperature, why did it develop that way? I mean, is it something regional, or please keep the question?
Yeah, so the question is, why did lager brewing develop? I always say when there's something that happened in history, it most likely it had to do with consumer preference, a law that was enacted, or some economic issue that or something economical that happened. I'm sure that it was a consumer preference. I think the talk is that they used to have stoneware mugs where you didn't see the beer, and a lighter beer with a clear, bright color that was filtered was at that point more appealing when they basically invented the glass drinking vessels. So it probably was a bunch of things that happened. The reason, or at least that's what is being told, the reason Pilsner became to be is the water in Pilsen was very soft, that an excellent hop variety grown in that area, and their malting barley was very good. And they came up with this new light lager beer, combined all those things, and it was a huge sales success. So it probably had to do something with being able to sell more beer.
Once again, it was also the first time that women were allowed to drink beer in public.
That would add
They like something that looked nice versus
just something. Yep. Despite the 9%, it's definitely still fairly sessionable. Yeah, so this one I would say is definitely more a beer that's got its flavors and aromas from the yeast that we use.
What does everybody think of this one? It seems to drink like 6%. Really, it doesn't seem like even close to 9. It doesn't seem like really 8 or 7, really. I mean, we have a lot of beers like that. Yeah. So before we go to the next beer, I have one question for you.
Yes.
That I'm really curious about, and I haven't for a long time. So, why do you guys think it's a good idea to name a beer something that people
That nobody can pronounce.
no one can pronounce it, nobody can read it, nobody knows what it is. So,
It would be it would be too easy if you could pronounce it, right?
obviously there are like backroom arguments going on about whether this is a good idea. So I don't know that's Wittewiven. So I'm just curious, like how it ends up happening.
We
Like, all right, I guess it's all good.
we try to always have a name that has a story or has some relationship to the beer or the country where it originated or something fun. So always, and sometimes those stories are related to a more complicated name, I guess. The worst one is probably Oachkatzlschwaf, our fest beer, our Oktoberfest beer, which is squirrel tail in German. We did think we probably should change the name, but then people liked it, and we said, no, well, we'll just stick with it. And yeah, so not trying to be difficult, but I guess you have to make people work for a little bit for the beer, right? So.
I mean, I've never seen any other brewery that be successful at it like you guys are, and you have had no problem. Yeah. So I mean, you know, why?
I guess it works.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. No. Well, except for Zwickel, we do. I have a picture of the beers that we brew over there, but we definitely want to keep the portfolio separate and for, yeah. I'll and then, no, it's for the most part we have different beers in Germany. Well, we're making a pale ale. We'll see. There's another example, but it's a weird German word that we have for one of the beers. So this one is currently only available in our sample pack that just got released, and thank you. And we also have it available in drafts. I think, I'm not sure, is it at both breweries right now? It probably will be in a few. It will be available at both places fairly soon. Yeah. If you buy this, you have to buy. But there's some other cool beers in there, and the next one we have is actually in there as well. Before we get to the next beer, I did want to talk about our two breweries, I guess. So we started out with the brewery in Midtown on Washington Avenue, not that far from here, I guess, probably 10 minutes maybe. You can see, if you haven't been there, you can see our brewing area here with the brew house in the front, our little taste room, and then we added a fairly classic or traditional Bavarian beer garden to the east of the building. I think after about a year and a half or so after opening up. We found the company in 2010 and then started brewing the first beer in early 2011. And as it happened, and honestly this was not planned, but we opened the doors on January 26th, which is totally meaningless to the rest of you, but it happens to be my birthday. So, it's a nice. It was a nice birthday present. Every year, it's a nice birthday present to be able to say, "Hey, we started. We opened the doors on that day." After about 2 years or so, we kind of ran out of space. We knew the building was fantastic. It's a great location, but we knew if we wanted to make more beer, at some point it was going to be challenging in terms of having enough space. So we started looking around for buildings, initially really just to find some space for storage. There's a lot of packaging materials, bottles, boxes. There's malt, there's equipment that we don't use on a daily basis. So started looking for buildings and came across the property on Manchester Avenue that we ended up setting the brewery up in. And totally fell in love with the building. It was perfect for future expansion. The whole setup was great. And this is a picture during construction. You can see there's still dust everywhere. The bar is being set up, and the brew house was just put into place. Took about 4 or 5 months or so to get everything wired up, connected, and up and running. And then we opened that brewery, about 2 years ago. In February 2014, right? I'm very bad with placing dates and times and stuff that happened. Here's another picture of one of our fermenters, one of the first fermenter being put into place. That's always a little nerve-wracking because you can see there the distance between that beam and that crane is not there's not a whole lot of space in between. So, but the guys that put that stuff into place really did a great job, and looks pretty nice from the street now. The building was basically used as a storage for Reynard paper, so for a paper company. Big warehouse, and we opened it up. You can see that here. There used to be a wall here, which is now windows, and you can see the fermenters from the street. So just opening up that building a little bit, I think, helped with the appeal. And this is the brew house the way it looks today. So 4-vessel system. 60 barrels per batch, and the beer hall itself has about 400 seats. So it's quite a large facility. And when we initially thought about setting this up, the guy that actually owns the company that made this equipment came in and said, hey, why don't you just put the bar right in front of it and then showcase it, and that's what we ended up doing. I think it looks really, really neat. And this is being used for production. So sometimes it gets a little bit louder, especially when we mash and when we make add the malt to the mash tun, because we have a conveyor, which is actually, oops, this red thing here, there's a chain in there and rattles a little bit, but for the most part, it's pretty good. And you can smell when we brew beer, so I think it's pretty cool. Thank you. I found a great chef that really does a nice job in making some good stuff. Okay, since you already have the next beer, so we're staying with the Belgian theme in this sampler pack. Mercator was basically the guy that invented the map of the world, sort of the way we know it today, and he was from Flanders. So naming a Flemish-style red ale after him just made sense. So this is a name that's not too bad, I guess, right? First one. So it is not German either, no. So the thing about this beer is it's basically a blend of several batches. So we made a beer that we put into red wine barrels probably about a year ago. We made some fresh beer based on that same recipe, basically a red ale. And then we also made a Berliner style type of that beer. So we kind of blended 3-4 different things together to come up with that taste. You definitely, it's a sour beer, so it definitely get that tartness from it. And you definitely get a little bit of that wood character of the barrels. Get a little bit of that astringency from the oak barrels. And I get a little bit of almost cherry, but again, this is just malt, yeast, and lactic acid bacteria that ferment the worts. A little bit of hops, again, not very important in this style, but really the fermentation and the wood aging created those flavors and create those fruity flavors. About 6% alcohol, it's a little bit higher, but again, probably a nice summer beer, pretty refreshing and good to kind of cleanse your palate with.
What does everybody think of this one? Yeah?
Fans of sour beer?
How many people
Yep.
like this beer? Raise your hand. How many people like this beer? And be honest, because it doesn't like beer. You've got plenty of other things to sell.
No,
How many people that's not really their thing?
which is honestly, I'm totally okay with that because I have beers I don't like. I mean, as long as we make a good effort, and I can appreciate it for the quality or for what it is, but there's certain things I don't choose to drink on a daily basis, just by, I guess, what I'm used to, what I like, what I prefer. But that's totally okay. So people have certain preferences, and that's how the things work. That's why we make so many different things, and hopefully there's something that you like.
Not sure I understood yet. The barrel, were they used to ferment wine?
Yeah, so they were used for red wine aging, and then we got them used basically. So you get a little bit of, I mean, I don't want to say you get some red wine character. Maybe there's definitely a little bit there, I'd say. To me, it's more the oaky character that you get, but definitely some red wine character.
I don't like sour beers at all. I like this.
Thank you. And it's not too sour, so it's kind of a semi. So we're looking at the acidity of the pH, and it's definitely more tart than a regular beer, but not at the total end of the spectrum. Okay. The next thing we've been sort of mentioning before.
You guys are getting a really small sample of the last beer. only have very little, so just make sure you have, a little bit of it when he gets to it.
And that beer definitely can warm up a little bit. So if you just keep it and let it warm up, that's not going to hurt the beer. Probably is going to improve it. So because we didn't have enough going on in our lives, last year we decided that it would be a fantastic idea to set up shop in Germany and make beer there. We kind of played around with the idea for a while and say, hey, it'd be fun to do something in Germany. There's a little bit of a craft beer movement with some smaller breweries setting up shop and starting up, and people starting to experience and try IPAs and pale ales and porters and stouts. So similar to, or somewhat similar to what happened in the US about probably 30, 40 years ago. So we heard about this brewery very close to where the hop farm of Florien sites is, closing down. It had been set up only about 15 years ago by basically a bunch of locals after the last local brewery closed. And they said, hey, we have to have a brewery in our town. It's the heart of the hop country. We want to drink our own beer. So they decided to sell some, thank you, to sell some shares and set up this small brewery. And unfortunately, didn't manage it very well. And yeah, about a year and a half ago, went in bankruptcy. And initially, I thought, hey, we can use the equipment and just bring it over here. We always need some more tanks and so on. But then I really thought one night, hey, why don't we just leave it there, start the brewery back up, come up with a new branding, new design of all the labels and the logo, and that's what we ended up doing. And we are now starting. We started brewing in May of last year, so it's almost been a year, and the locals have really come to like the beer, and I've not had a critical word of anything. And we do branded Urban Chestnut, so it's a very small town in Bavaria, just north of Munich here, not too far from Munich Airport. If you ever happen to be in the area, it's really pretty, right in the heart of Hallertau, the hop growing area. This is the town that is in, and it's pretty much surrounded with hop fields, so definitely fun in the summer when the hops are growing. A little bit more depressing in the winter when you only see the empty fields, but very, very pretty in the summer. It is also home to the German Hop Museum, which is very cool. I'm assuming you're all interested in beer. Even if you are not, it's a very cool museum that kind of talks about hop growing and hop harvesting throughout the ages. Very, very impressive, very nicely done. And the design of the building, you can kind of tell here, is to kind of mimic a hop yard. So very cool, right in the center of town. It's also the town where the Hallertau Hop Queen gets elected every year. So if you happen to be in town in the middle of August, you get to see that. And this is the brew house. And the brewmaster that we hired actually happens to be the brother of Florien Seitz. This is Georg Seitz, so the guy that runs the hop farm that sells us a lot of hops, actually is now running the brewery. He did an internship for us here in the US a while ago, and it was just perfect because he was looking for a job in that area, and he's now running the brewery. Very small system, 20 hectoliters, so about 17 barrels. And we make 3 main beers there. The main difference is that we have open fermenters there, which is kind of cool. So you can definitely, when you walk through there and we ferment, you definitely smell what's going on. It's really cool to see that process. Well, open fermenters as in they have open tops. So they're not enclosed tanks like this here. They have open tops and No. We're trying to keep, so the room, you see, it's all tiled and kept clean. So the idea is to just basically, well, one thing is you can observe the whole process, but also there's no pressure on the yeast, so it's definitely makes different, definitely has an impact on the flavor, because this is all bottom ferment. Well, not all of it, but most of the stuff we make there is lagers or bottom fermenting yeast. We don't have a bottling line there, so we take the beer to another brewery to get packaged, which is nice because packaging is a lot of headaches. So that's nice to just be able to make the beer there.
So all that beer kept in Germany,
Yeah, pretty much around town. 10 miles around the brewery for the most part. We are working on bringing some beer over, but it's going to be a few months till that happens. But yeah, the vast majority really gets sold. In Bavaria, there's a saying, you sell the beer around the chimney of the brewery, so very close around the brewery, 5-10 miles, I'd say, for the most part. Mm-hmm. Resistance? I think we're so small that they... well, it's interesting in Germany. I think it's a little bit different here because when craft beer started to happen, you were basically down to 3 companies that made beer. There's a few more, I realize that, but for the most part, it was 3 companies owning 80+% of the market, and you had basically one style of beer that was, again, 80-90% of what was being sold. In Germany, there's still over 1,000 breweries right now. The diversity of styles is a little bit more there, and most of these breweries are at least 100 years old. Some of them are even older than that. So for them to now say, hey, it's all been about tradition. Now we're totally changing course and making all these new styles. It's much harder. And I think the consumer base, they're not going to totally switch and say, hey, I'm not going to drink my Helles or my wheat beer anymore. I think there's definitely interest in the new beers. I don't think it's going to be totally going to change the market, but I think the nice thing that happens is beer used to be cheap and you just bought it, and whatever was cheapest you would buy at the time. Now you see a little bit of a change where beer becomes a little bit more attractive again and becomes something exciting that people talk about and enjoy. And I think that's the biggest aspect of what's going on. So the beers that we make there is a hoppy Helles called Hopfen Hop Pearl. Nice little story on that one because when we bought we only bought the assets of the old company, and this brand was part of it, and it had been or originated in the 1950s as much as I can say at this point. I haven't really found any definite source of how long that's been around, but it's been 60 or 70 years. And when that local brewery closed, it was bought by Spaten, which is AB InBev now, and they let the trademark lapse, and then the previous owners of the brewery that we bought got the trademark. So we now have an old trademark from that town, which is kind of cool. And I think that's just a great name. We do have our Zwickel, pretty much the same recipe. The water's different, so it does taste a little bit different over there. And then we have a pale ale. And here we go again with the names, although Bavarians do understand that. That's Zurgrost, which is basically transplant. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's typically somebody that didn't grow up in Bavaria that moved to Bavaria because it's the best state in Germany and it's the most the prettiest place. And people in Bavaria call those Zurgrost. They were basically foreigners / people that were transplants ultimately. So having an American style in Bavaria, brewed in America, just was a perfect name for that beer.
On the bottom of the labels, does that say
brewed according to the purity law? Yes. Yep. Yeah, so you can tell we didn't want to hide the fact that we're Urban Chestnut. We've got the logo on the labels, but we did want to stay fairly traditional, so it's kind of a nice compromise. And we didn't know what to expect, and we argued, should we just come up with a new name for the brewery, be very traditional? We said, now we don't want to hide that. We really want to, people are going to know who we are anyway. I grew up not too far from there. I've actually got 2 cousins in the next town over, so I've been to I was in the area quite a bit when I was a small child. I speak the local dialect, so it's much easier to kind of sell that aspect of it. And it's been really a lot of fun to do that. And Augustiner, which is a fairly large brewery out of Munich, was kind of dominating the market there. And the young people in town now drink our beer, which is kind of cool. So we're quite a bit more expensive because it's a very small operation, but people seem to really enjoy it, and we've had several situations where we ran out of beer, which is, I guess, good, but you don't want to do that too often. Yes? There's a restaurant right next door. We don't own that or we don't operate it, but it's a couple that runs the restaurant, and they have our beer, and they're fantastic people to make great food. Very nice little beer garden next to it, and yeah, it's fantastic to have them there. I'm not a person that I know we have 2 restaurants here in St. Louis. Don't necessarily. I'm not a restaurant person. I want to make beer, and that's what we're good at, and that's why this whole separation is quite nice. All right, so that's the German brewery, and took a little bit longer, so getting to the last beer. So this has never been packaged in bottles. It's a imperial stout called Frails, and I think, well, Frails Brewery was a brewery in London that brewed imperial stout for the Russian court and exported there, and that's where that name comes from. In this case, that beer is bourbon barrel aged, and then after bourbon barrel aging, we added some cherry juice and fermented that again, and that's why it's got that fruity note. So you definitely get some of the bourbon, some of that vanilla, woody character. So the story of this keg is we did this about a year ago, and Chad saved the keg. So I think we made it a year and a half, 2 years ago. We may have added some more yeast to get the fermentation going again. Definitely get a little bit of apple, cherry notes. Definitely some of the bourbon. It's probably let it warm up a little bit. Mine is probably still a little bit cold, but fairly complex. And you can definitely feel the slight burn, the alcohol. So this is about 11% or so. So definitely up there. But an interesting thing, I actually came by yesterday because I wanted to taste it, make sure that it's still good, because you never know with these beers after a year what happens. But typically those really strong beers, they tend to develop over time, and it's quite fascinating to see what happens, especially when they're barrel aged. Quite interesting. Definitely feel the warming now in my throat, so definitely higher up there in terms of the alcohol.